Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink, Thursday, January 18th. I had hoped that today's guest would be coming on today to talk about IU's NCAA tournament resume, but there isn't much of a resume to speak of. But Andy Bottoms of the Assembly Call and the bracketologist for Inside the Hall is back on Podcast on the Brink. How you doing today, Andy?
I'm doing good. Yeah, I wish we had a little bit more exciting things to talk about from a bracketology standpoint. Always more fun when I use in that discussion for me as somebody who does it, but also who follows the team. But I think they and a number of other Big Ten teams are not in good position at all as we enter the latter part of January.
Yeah, I do want to talk a little bracketology before we start talking about the team. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on. Obviously, there's some teams that are clearly going to make the NCAA tournament from the Big Ten: Illinois, Wisconsin, Purdue, chief among them. But after that, seems like there's still a lot to be decided with some teams that are maybe not really on the bubble at this point, but pretty darn close to it. And a team in Ohio State that I think a lot of people had thought early in the year would make the tournament. Now a lot of the projections on the outside looking in. But why do you feel just in general this season for the Big Ten has been as tumultuous as it has been for a league, and maybe why we're headed for a scenario where it's the fewest amount of Big Ten teams getting in the dance as we have had in a while?
Yeah, I think it starts with how the league performed in the non-conference. Really, I think going back a number of years had traditionally had a number of good showings across multiple teams. I mean, that really sets the stage if you think about some of these metrics where, if all you're looking at is conference games, you're only being compared to one another. It's easy to kind of get things thrown off there. But the non-conference really gives you a chance to prove yourself against other leagues. And the Big Ten, in large part, did not do that this year. Purdue had a really strong offseason. And other than that, there were a couple good wins. Ohio State's over Alabama may end up being a huge one for them. Michigan State beating Baylor falls in that category as well. But generally speaking, the league struggled there. There were probably more bad losses than there had been in previous years as well. And I think you had a lot of teams struggle with something similar to IU, where they won those games but didn't necessarily win them impressively. I'd put, I think Ohio State is one I was looking at recently that was kind of in that category, that really, have a decent number of wins, but didn't really blow hardly anybody out as they were able to get through non-conference play. And so that really sets the stage for how many good wins you can get in the league. And right now, the best wins that you can get in the league outside of just road games are Purdue, Wisconsin, Illinois. And there's some road games that, based on the way the quadrant system works, fall in quad one. But I just think back to some of these other years. If you've got a lot of teams that are ranked highly in the net, even home games against those teams can give you quad one opportunities. So I think if you look, and I haven't really done this yet, I think the balance of quad one versus quad two opportunities for the league this year has kind of flipped as a result of that. Whereas in years past, you'd have a ton of stuff that really fell into quad one, and you could fall back on what the committee has shown to like is, losses aren't great, but if you rack up a ton of wins against Q1 games, then you're in pretty good shape. And I think this year that balance has shifted more too. There's probably more Q2 games to be had, or low end quad one games, and so I think that'll ultimately lead to I don't know if it's not going to just be those three, but I do think it's hard to see them getting even 7 feels like a stretch, I would say, at this point.
So barring a miraculous turnaround or, winning the Big Ten tournament, obviously Indiana not likely to be an NCAA tournament team. But one of the things that, I've tried to keep track of as the season has gone along is just kind of, the metrics you talk about. You look at things like the net and Ken Palm and Bart Torvik, and Indiana's kind of been on a steady, I don't feel like they're falling now, but they're kind of to a place where they haven't moved in a while. They started out in a lot of those numbers, so specifically Torvik and Ken Palm, in that high 40s, the low 50s range, and have kind of moved downwards. Is that, not to oversimplify this, but despite having a 12-6 record, which, if you looked at that and they had some maybe some better wins, you wouldn't say that's a terrible record, but it was was the slide in the metrics for IU directly tied to the fact that they played so many close games against inferior competition?
Yeah, I pretty much directly tied to that. It's somewhat simple in that regard. If you looked at what expectations would have been to win these games, beating Florida Gulf Coast by 6, Army by 8, Wright State by 9, just not having. I mean, we're that far in. Even Louisville only winning by 8. Just didn't have enough big wins, and you've seen teams highlighted. Like an Iowa State as an example that had a really high net. BYU was that way as well, that just absolutely ran teams off the court. And I don't know that IU had to do that in those games, but I think you had to, the number of comfortable wins that IU's had this year, if you just kind of take the bracketology out of it and look at it from a fan's perspective of, all right, how many games have I sat there in the second half and been like, okay, I can kind of kick my feet up and just sit back and watch the game. There haven't been very many of those. And so that ultimately is what did it. And now you're pushing, against that and trying to have to offset that. And so I sit there finding myself against Minnesota, like, you need to win by 20. You've got to find ways to do that. And when they get a couple easy baskets late, like, you can say it doesn't matter. We can say that that's stupid. But ultimately that's the way the system works. And this team, dug itself such a hole that it has to find ways to do that. Now, that being said, they're at a point now where they're not projected to win very many games. So even just winning by small margins against some of the Big Ten teams that they'll play would inherently push their numbers up, as would just winning in general. But yeah, you look at, I think Rutgers a few years ago was the highest net ever to get in at 77. They had some really, really top end wins, had more bad losses than IU has right now. But, you really got to do some damage, and losing a home game like they did against Purdue the other night makes it that much tougher. That's a game that is not going to be easy by any stretch of the imagination. But at least if you're at home thinking, okay, now can I get this? Can I get like one huge marquee win that we can hang our hat on and move forward? Didn't do that. Now makes these other, and particularly these next 2 games, which are really the most meaningful games left on the schedule because they're both on the road against the other 2 really good teams, makes those that much more important in games that are both going to be really challenging for IU based on how we've seen this team play so far this year.
I feel like with the work that you do at Assembly Call, you've got a pretty good feeling in terms of the fan temperature and where the fan base is right now. Obviously, I hear a lot of it too with the community at Inside the Hall and all the social media. And I feel like there's been a noticeable shift recently just in terms of how fans are looking at Mike Woodson in terms of where he is in his tenure. And just, I think the story kind of going into the season was Mike Woodson took over for Archie Miller and kind of, I talked about him bringing some stability to the program, right? He came in, made the tournament his first 2 years, took over in a situation where Indiana hadn't been in the tournament for a while. People were happy with that. And obviously there was the expectation that there was going to be some level of drop off this season based on who they lost in the offseason and kind of what they replaced it with, not getting as much help maybe as they needed in the portal. How significant of a shift have you felt just kind of interacting with fans and with what you do at Assembly Call, and just kind of, as a fan yourself, just in terms of how you're thinking about where the program is right now under Woodson midway through year 3?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, and I think part of that comes from getting on and doing post-game shows right after the game when everybody's emotions are the highest. And so I probably shouldn't judge it off of the chat after on the shows after those games, and I probably shouldn't judge it completely after you've had a couple of days to say, oh, you know what, I can explain this away. I think it's like most things is somewhere in the middle. When I look at it, I think that the Woodson piece of it becomes a few things. I think the roster construction is getting a ton of conversation this year, and rightfully so. I think certainly in retrospect, but I think even at the time, everyone could see, and it wasn't that they didn't go after backcourt help in the portal. They just didn't get it. And so you were left putting a lot of eggs in the Xavier Johnson, Trey Galloway basket and really hoping that CJ Gunn would develop. And I think Galloway has, certainly from an efficiency standpoint, hasn't been what he was a year ago, but I think he's done some good things. You've seen progress from him from a raw number standpoint. Assist rate is way up. Part of that because X missed some time. But what IU've gotten from Xavier Johnson, injury notwithstanding, even in the games that he's been healthy, has been really up and down, and they needed a level of stability that maybe in retrospect, it was foolish to expect from him, but I think that's what the staff ended up having to do. And you can't absolve them from what the roster looks like right now. I think the other thing that's come up a lot is player development. And I think that's one that maybe is a little unfair. You can certainly point to examples of guys who've not developed or not developed as quickly as you might have wanted them to. So CJ Gunn, as I mentioned before, I think Caleb Banks is one that gets lumped into that. But I also think you look at what they've been able to do with a guy like Khalil Ware coming in with a lot of questions. I think he's answered those questions and then some. They've gotten a lot out of him. And I think you can't only, get on the staff for not developing other guys, but then refuse to give them credit for what they've been able to do with him. I think you've seen real growth from Malik Renew. And I think even in season, you've seen that from Mackenzie Mbako. Started out, was really up and down, scored in double figures, I think, in just one of the first 5 games. And now he's in double figures 11 of the last 13, I think when I looked at it this morning. And so I think you've seen a staff that was willing to stick with him, help him work through things, help him try to turn the corner. And I think you even saw some, I thought we mentioned this on the post-game show after Purdue, that defensively he was not a clear liability as he had been in other games. I mean, anybody who would watch for a little while early in the season, he really struggled in that regard. And I think he's made some progress there. And as a guy who really competes and really was not afraid of anything in the Purdue game, sometimes to a fault. But so I think those are two of the main criticisms that you hear. I think one is probably fair, one maybe not so much. And I think where that leaves you is a team that's really inconsistent from game to game, that is probably not going to totally bottom out. Hopefully I don't regret saying this, but I don't think they're going to bottom out like the Arch year where they lost all those games. Because I think there's enough talent to overcome some of those things. But I also look at, are they putting these guys in the best place to succeed? And I've made this equivalence a little bit to the Eagles as an Eagles fan over the last part of the season. One of the things that came up on Eagles podcasts and things that I read was the players can tell when the coaching staff doesn't have answers for what they're seeing from the defense. This was a big thing with Jalen Hurts against the Bliss. What are the answers? Their defense totally collapsed. What are your answers to what's happening? And I think it feels like right now, I don't know that there's a huge confidence in the fan base that this coaching staff has answers for, and Mike Woodson in particular, for what they're seeing on the court. I think you see a team that competes really hard at times, like the beginning of the second half against the Purdue game, and then has lulls with that. You see the 2 foul substitution stuff and Mackenzie Mbako sitting too long. Like, everybody's kind of sitting back and seeing like, you've got to get him back in the game, and it doesn't happen. You see the line change subs, you see the long 2-point shots that Jared mentioned and Ryan did the film session about. I think those are things that make people ask questions and say, like, does Mike Woodson have the answers for these questions? And some of what you see, I think, is where people are starting to, at least at this point, get a little bit leery of whether the answer to that is yes or no.
Do you think those questions were maybe there the first 2 years? But they were somewhat masked by the fact that Indiana maybe had a better mix of players and were able to overcome some of that by just winning based on their talent? And those are these issues that are new in your eyes?
I think a little bit of both. Jared wrote up a really good piece on our Substack yesterday and talked about some of the long twos and kind of, he said, even his own thought process around watching Jalen Hood-Schifino take a lot of those last year, where you eventually got to a point where it's like, this is where he's comfortable. He's proven to be effective there. He's making a high percentage of these shots. So it's okay to go against maybe the conventional basketball wisdom that's a bad shot, because for him, it wasn't. The game at Purdue is the kind of the ultimate thing that proves some of that. But I do think there are other pieces in terms of scheme. I think some of the defensive questions that have come up this year have come up in the past. But I also feel like we've seen, and maybe that's still coming this year, some adjustments that they've been able to make in other years to rectify some of those. And I think this year we just haven't seen that consistently. I think there have been games when it was like, you can kind of see him doing something a little bit different schematically on defense, but then it regresses a little bit as you go forward. And I do think the defense has actually gotten a little bit better. And I think the offense, one of the other points that Jared made was, this is a team that is elite at getting to the free throw line and among the worst teams in the country at actually making free throws. And so it's that weird juxtaposition of, one of your greatest strengths puts one of your greatest weaknesses at the forefront. And you've probably been a part of more debates on free throw shooting and what causes that from an IU perspective over your time running the site than anybody. I don't think there's any real answer to that question, but I just think it's some of those contradictions. But I think you're right. I think there have been times in each season so far where some of these same questions have come up. I think that's fair. And having a veteran group last year with TJD and Miller Kopp, whose contributions I think were probably underrated in retrospect. And obviously Jalen was not underrated in that regard, but yeah, just a lot of drop off and certainly had maybe pieces different last year to help cover over some of those questions.
You talk, a little bit about just the coaching and adjustments. And that's one thing that I've really been thinking about more lately, like what defines good coaching. And one thing I keep coming back to is a coach obviously has to adjust somewhat to the personnel that he has on the roster and the team that he has. And I feel like that to me has kind of been maybe one of the more disappointing things about this particular season is that it feels like the Indiana continues to maybe try to do some of the same things over and over and expect different results. It doesn't feel like there's been a lot of flexibility in terms of the game plan and different things that they can try. And I think a lot of times the best coaching jobs are done when, you maybe lose a guy or two to injury and you have to adjust something, or you realize that maybe something's not working and you go to something else. But I've not necessarily seen that with this particular team. And I think that's one thing that is a fair criticism. Would you agree maybe that this team maybe hasn't always been put in the best positions to succeed? And it feels like sometimes, when Woodson's questioned about these things and asked about it, he almost, it almost seems like he's annoyed that, people ask him about, the lack of 3-point shooting, or, he'll kind of maybe not, I asked him a question a couple of weeks ago just about, the defensive rebounding, like specifically, like, what do you do to kind of make this better? And it was just like, well, we just work on it. And I'm like, that isn't necessarily an explanation that gives me a ton of confidence, like that there's a plan in place to kind of address this issue. And so I think that's kind of one of the things, like big picture, that has me maybe a little bit more concerned in terms of the direction, is just, at this point the roster is what it is. You can talk about like Indiana should have got more guards in the spring. Well, these are the players that they have right now. And I don't necessarily feel like these players are always being put in the best positions for this team to maximize its talent, if that makes sense. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think so. And I think some of the things that you mentioned, you mentioned in the number of offensive rebounds this team gives up. They did similar last year. I mean, they were at 29% last year. They're 30.7 this year. Like at some point, the 3-point shooting is an example. The 3-point rate was 26.6% last year, 27.6% this year. Like at some point, that's a feature and not a bug, if you will. Like this is what is being asked. And I think you even see, we've talked about this a number of times on the show. Like guys at the 3-point line sometimes just don't have their hands out, like ready to catch the ball and shoot, because it doesn't seem like it's emphasized. Again, nobody's in practice. I'm not, you're not, all those things. All we can judge it by is what's on the court. And I think you see that also in some of these long twos. A couple of the examples that Ryan shared, the one with Xavier Johnson in the corner. I mean, the guy, he's catching the ball as Lawyer is closing out. He's in the middle of the lane and didn't take the three. Instead, kind of slowly did a shot fake, stepped in and did it. There was another one later, CJ Gunn, that's the closeout's much shorter in that scenario, but he passes up what was a good 3-point shot for a team that has shot the ball, for as much as everybody has said this team can't shoot, all these things. Like they've shot the ball reasonably well from 3-point range. And I think there's reason to believe they can and should take more of those shots, and they're going to have to open things up, but doesn't shoot that shot, pulls in, takes a tougher shot. Like it's hard to watch some of those things and not feel like that there's some emphasis on, I don't think there's an emphasis on, yes, you need to take long twos, but I think there is maybe a de-emphasis on taking some of the 3-pointers. I think we've seen the rebounding stuff. Tony did a good breakdown on that, where there's different things that are leading to that, but there's just a lot of times nobody's making any contact and somebody just runs right by them. That happened a couple of times in the Purdue game as well. And so I do think and Ryan has mentioned this, Ryan Phillips, that there's an inherent stubbornness to NBA coaches, and I think that may lead to some of what you perceived as annoyance or whatever, and the belief that having coached at a certain level and those kinds of things. And if I'd coached at that level, I'd probably think that too.
Yeah.
Seeing the success of the last couple seasons, while maybe not at the peak of what IU fans would want, I think he can and should feel good about what this team has accomplished over the last couple of years. And so I think that's fine. The challenge becomes this year's team, given what it has at the guard position, is in a difficult spot where you're either having to play Gabe Cup so much more than you ever thought you would, trying to figure out what to do with Xavier Johnson right now, and Trey Galloway in a role that he's really having to take on probably too much. And I think that's, as much as anything, has had a somewhat negative impact in the areas where he hasn't played as well. But you also see some of the substitution pattern stuff, and I do think I've noticed a difference there. So I can't, I'm not going to sit here and say they're not making any adjustments. I think that has gotten better, at least in terms of like mixing in some of the players. But we talked about this a lot with CJ Gunn. You put him in with the second unit, the pressure on him to score is way different than when he's out there with some of the starters. And are you helping his development by putting him in that situation, or can you find ways to get him minutes where he's getting catch and shoot opportunities because of who you have? And it's all easy to say in retrospect and those kinds of things. But I do think even another small one, not to go too long on the question, but when you've got the Ware and Renew in, Ware is not as comfortable with his back to the basket. He's more comfortable stepping out and being able to hit shots. Not that Renew hasn't hit shots, but Renew is a great playmaker in the post. So a lot of times when one of those guys are running high-low things, it's the inverse. It's Renew's the one out top. And I think that's probably because he's a better passer. But Ware's in the post, and he's just not as comfortable there with the physicality and with those things. And so that to me is a somewhat easy example of, can you maximize what their strengths are and their comfort levels are by doing something different? Because otherwise you just run the risk that everybody's just collapsing into the lane. And we just see that so much with this team. Purdue did it a ton, where 5 guys are in or right outside of the lane and somebody has to step up and make shots. They did that in the second half. That helped them get back in it there for a brief period. But, more often than not, it's just, that's how teams are going to defend IU, and you've got to find ways to counteract that.
Yeah, I do think it was maybe the Minnesota game where Ware didn't play particularly well in the first half, and some of it was, they tried to force feed him the ball a little bit in the post and didn't look necessarily comfortable. But then the second half, I felt like they got him, kind of moving and throwing some lobs, and that's really the strength of his offensive game. If you're going to try to use him to get him the ball around the basket, the recipe isn't necessarily just to kind of feed it in there and let him go to work. So I did think that was an adjustment they made in the Minnesota game. Kind of going back to the 3-point shooting in general, there was a comment Woodson made. I don't remember exactly when it was. It was a couple of weeks ago, but he was talking about shooting 3-pointers, and he kind of said shooting threes is what it is. When you shoot them, you've got to make them. Have you been surprised at all just at how maybe the program doesn't seem to value the 3-point shot as much as you would expect from a coach coming from the NBA? Because, you look at what Woodson did with some of those Knicks teams, and he's famously kind of talked about as a guy that got Steve Novak paid in New York because of all the, the threes that he was able to take there. And it just seems like coming from that game where really he was kind of in the NBA as a head coach just right before really the Warriors kind of took off in terms of shooting all those threes. And I'm not saying that IU has to be, a team that's taking 30, 35 threes a game. It kind of seems like their indifference to utilizing that part of the game at times kind of feels like a style of play that's, not really suited for today's game and where things are.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's I'm trying to think how best to say this. I don't think they are opposed to them, but I think the way they go about getting them is maybe different. Getting 3-point shots is different than what other teams do. This came up a lot when Miller Kopp was, would stand in the corner and space the floor, and there's a reason for that, and that's somewhat of an NBA concept as well. The difference is a lot of the other guys on the floor in an NBA game are maybe more adept at attacking closeouts or doing different things. You're running other actions where even if he's stationary in the corner, you're going to find his way into shots maybe more so than what IU would do. And so, as opposed to really kind of dribble driving and things like that. IU is getting a lot of theirs on post kickouts and ball rotation after that. Versus, Alabama is like the obvious example here, just because they shoot tons of threes and all that. And so I don't, this from where this team is to where what they're doing, but it is a basically continuous series of ball screens and attacking closeouts and finding ways to get guys shots. And they are the absolute extreme where, I look at IU and those, I think the span of time in the game of the 5 long twos that Ryan had in the film session was like 12 minutes. And IU shot 5, at least 5. He may have not put them all in there. Like if Alabama goes a game and shoots 5 of those shots, like a game and shoots 5 of those shots, you would be surprised. But the way they're generating their 3-point shots is just way different than what you see IU do. And this isn't to say that one approach is right or wrong, but there's one that kind of is at least more aligned to modern basketball and things like that. And I think during the first 2 seasons of Woodson, when you had Trace, it was easy to look and say, well, Mike Woodson's not running the offense that he kind of talked about with the whole 4 out, 1 in and all of those things because he adapted to the personnel. And I think that's true. But then you look at the personnel this year and it's like you're kind of in the same position. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have players like Malik Purdue and Khalil Ware, because they've both been great. They've arguably been IU's 2 best players and most consistent players over the course of the season. So you don't want to turn away guys like that and say, well, you don't fit into my system. You should be able to have a system that can fit talented guys that way. But I just think it's more a function of how they're generating those 3-point shots than anything else. Whereas, again, this year they're, middle of the pack 3-point shooting. So for as ugly as it had looked at times, they're shooting it well enough that it can still be something that can potentially help their offensive efficiency over the remainder of the season if they're able to find ways to do that and get more shots for a guy like Mackenzie Mbako and who's really shooting extremely well in Big Ten play at the very least.
Yeah, so it looks like the next 2 games obviously coming up, Wisconsin and Illinois on the road, going to be 2 really tough environments. Obviously, we know the history of the Kohl Center, and this is one of Greg Gard's better teams that he's had, at least in recent years. And credit to him, after last year's season where, a lot of people had Wisconsin as a tournament team going to the year, they make the NIT. And I know a lot of people up there were not particularly thrilled. Gets most of his team back, and he actually went out and made a portal ad that was kind of out of the box for what Wisconsin typically adds from the standpoint of he goes and gets AJ Storr from St. John's, who I believe was on one of the fastest tempo teams in the country coming from the St. John's system. Now he's at Wisconsin playing really well, 15 points a game. And then Illinois, obviously, without Terrence Shannon now probably for the rest of the season, but they've still figured out a way to win games. And, looking back at that hiring cycle of 2017, Illinois definitely won when they hired Brad Underwood. Indiana at that time hired Archie Miller, and Ohio State Chris Holtmann all in the same offseason. But Brad Underwood is clearly proven to be the best hire of those 3 games. But when you're going into these games where it looks like Indiana's obviously going to be probably a double-digit underdog in both of these contests, what do you look for just in terms of progress going into games like these? Obviously, I feel like there's no expectation for Indiana to win in Wisconsin until they actually do. I mean, they were even, I think 2 years ago, up 20, I think in that game, Mike Woodson's first year, and still found a way, I think, to lose by 5. So it's tough to foresee a win, but what do you think would be progress after the Purdue debacle and going into what, 2 of the tougher road games left on the schedule?
Yeah, I'm right there with you on the Wisconsin one. I'm not sure it would matter what the circumstances are of the game, let alone the fact that IU's going there after a loss and Wisconsin also going after a tough loss on the road at Penn State. We'll be wanting to get back on the right side of things. For me, I think the biggest thing is just seeing, and you don't love to say this at this point in the season, but just seeing like more consistent effort and more consistent competitiveness from guys that are on the court. I think this team has played really well in spurts, even in games that it's lost. A lot of times the start of the game, they've played really well, and even the start of the second half. And I think, and another thing, not to give Jared too much pub on here, but tweeted out how well that starting lineup had really been with Cups in there. And so they're getting off to decent starts. How do they sustain that as other guys come into the game? How do they sustain that as guys get tired? And that goes back to some of the substitution patterns. But to me, that's really the biggest thing. This team has to just compete more consistently. I think offensive rebounding, not something that Wisconsin has traditionally focused a great deal on. They're actually a little bit higher ranked this year than most. But it's again, this IU team just isn't good enough defensively to give up a ton of easy baskets to teams, and that is an area that Illinois has really excelled this year. So I think being able to do that and just being able to contain guys defensively and not get set up to have give up wide open threes and some of those things. And so again, they both present different challenges. Illinois uses the 3-point shot a lot. Wisconsin, not so much. It's definitely a contrast in styles as you look through the two. But I think the biggest thing is just kind of competing consistently, and guard play, I guess, would be the other. We talked about this on the show a lot the other night. I mean, the difference between what IU did in the backcourt, even for as much as Trey Galloway just tried to put the team on his back in the second half, if you compare that to what Lawyer and Jones and Smith did, it's just a huge gap. And kind of going back to some of the guys that you look at who have played well, who have shown progress in the season. It's Mbako, it's Renew, it's even Anthony Walker. I think has done more off the bench than a lot of people would have expected. Like, you're getting as much, if not more, than what you hoped you'd get out of those guys by and large. You've got to start finding consistently somebody else to step up and score in the backcourt and be able to contribute there on both ends of the court. So those are probably the two things: just competitiveness and guard play.
Last thing before we wrap up, I want to kind of go back to the bracketology thing. I know you're going to be kind of ramping up there in terms of doing the brackets. I think weekly moving forward or close to that. I'm curious, just from a national perspective right now, what's maybe the most intriguing storyline or two that you're looking at as you kind of put these brackets together each week? And kind of another thing I've been thinking about, and maybe we say this every year now, but because there really hasn't been that one dominant team in college basketball for a couple of years now, but it feels like we're headed for yet another year where it's going to be wide open. We saw obviously last year with Florida Atlantic making that run to the Final Four, and obviously another one seed went down last year in the first round with Purdue falling. It feels like maybe we could be on a collision course for another year where it's going to be a wild NCAA tournament. You kind of feeling the same way on that?
Yeah, I think so. Because even as the first two seed lines, at least for this week, were fairly well defined. I think there's maybe 6 teams in the mix for a one seed. I think Purdue and you kind of separated themselves a little bit, and then you've got Houston, Kansas, North Carolina, and Arizona close to each other for the other one. So you're going to have a pretty strong 2 line. Tennessee and Wisconsin, who Wisconsin may not end up there after losing at Penn State, but those 8 had felt like they kind of separated themselves. But even once you get past that, you got a Baylor team. They lost this week, but and the Michigan State loss remains kind of puzzling. But they've been solid. Kentucky has played really well. Just don't maybe have the number of quality wins that push them up from a seedless perspective. IU fans saw Auburn firsthand. They've been impressive. You got Duke in there. Memphis keeps winning games. And then you get down to some of these, a Marquette, a Creighton, Alabama that we talked about. So I think you've got a lot of teams, even as you get into the, teams that now might sit on the 4 line or something like that, who were either highly ranked coming into the season or have outperformed their expectations. So I think there's a lot of good teams. I definitely would say from a resume perspective, Purdue has really separated itself. But the Big Ten struggles in the tournament are well documented. I don't need to tell anybody who's listening to this about that. And then the other storyline is just, from a conference perspective, like how many teams can the Mountain West get? There's, some discussion, like, could they get 6 teams? They really have 6 who have maybe not totally separated themselves from everybody else, but have put together some solid work in the non-conference and positioned that league, maybe in contrast to the Big Ten, well, for even if they're beating up on each other at the top, can you get some good wins there? So I think you've got a league like that may well get as many or more teams than the ACC or even the Big Ten, and almost certainly would get more than the Pac-12. So just kind of an intriguing thing from a league perspective. And the Big 12 is, just remains tremendous, and kind of seeing who emerges from the carnage that will surely meet that conference over the course of the season. But a lot of teams up toward the top there, and just kind of can a couple emerge that really push them up the sea line, or do you just have a bunch? It's become maybe a Big Ten of years past where everybody just beats up on each other, and you have tons of teams clustered around. Like last year, within 2 games of 500, you have almost the whole league. Some of that impacts your seeding as you go through there, but I think that's will be a pretty game in, game out, exciting league to watch.
Yeah, I wondered with the Big 12 if maybe some of the additions that they made would maybe water it down a little bit, but some of the teams that they've added have been up to the task, and it's been good. I mean, it's as deep as it's ever been. So don't watch a ton of Big 12, obviously, with trying to watch as much Big 10 as possible, but kind of watching it from afar, it definitely seems like the cream of the crop in terms of conferences.
Yeah, I'm still getting used to UC fans here talking about Big 12 basketball, so I definitely understand the newness of some of the teams. Yeah, it's weird.
UCF beat Kansas the other night, right?
Yeah, they beat them. They gave somebody else a pretty good game after that, and then BYU's been good. Cincinnati's been good, but yeah, I'm still struggling to get myself into the being here in Cincinnati, and it's a Big 12 team, but here we are.
Yeah, UCF beat Kansas, then narrowly lost to BYU, and then beat Texas on the road. So they're
that's right. They beat Texas. I knew they beat somebody. Oh, that's right. The Rodney Terry getting upset on the handshake line about the horns down thing. So
yep. So make sure you're following Andy, of course, on Twitter, X, whatever they're calling it now, at Andy Bottoms. Listen to him on the Assembly Call. I think Assembly Call Radio will be on tonight. I'm not sure if you're going to be on this week's episode or not, Andy.
Yeah, I'm on that tonight. I will not be on the post game tomorrow, but yeah.
Lucky you. You get taking the night off for Wisconsin. That's a good.
I know, but I'll still end up.
Who's on?
I think Jared. I think Ryan will be on that one. So I mean, anytime you can match up the Cole Center and Ryan, you pretty much have to. So that should be gold regardless.
All right. We always looking. I did not listen after Purdue because I was sitting here finishing my work. I'm like, I usually turn it on. I'm like, I just watched the beatdown. I don't know how much more I need to hear about this. So hopefully, that was actually probably a good thing that Ryan wasn't on there for his rant for that one.
It was. I attempted to fill in my best for him. I didn't lose it at one point, but I definitely was maybe more animated than I had been other times. So I did my best to fill his shoes.
Andy, thanks for coming on. I always enjoy listening to you on the Assembly Call and enjoy reading all the bracketology work you do. It's excellent stuff.
All right. Well, thanks for having me as always, and look forward to working through bracketology with you again this season.
All right. Thanks everybody, as always, for listening to another episode of Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating or a review over on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.